between the words that are spoken and the words that are heard. May the Spirit of God be present. Amen. The other night, my wife and I watched the musical Annie. It seemed the right choice for Fogust in San Francisco. The sun will come out in October. But anything to lift our spirits. I learned that the musical was based on the comic strip Little Orphan Annie, written back in the 1920s by a man named Harold Gray. He was a right-wing populist who thought the poor should lift themselves up by their bootstraps, absolutely detested FDR and the New Deal. He died in the 1960s, and when the comic strip was adapted for Broadway as a musical in the 1970s, the writer, Thomas Mehan, decided to subvert Gray's politics. In the musical, Annie is compassionate towards the homeless. And not only that, she's rescued from the murderous orphanage director by none other than FDR. And when it all concludes, the musical ends with a rousing number, "We'll have a new deal for Christmas." We ended the day toes tapping, reminding each other we have nothing to fear but fear itself. Well, that didn't last long. We were back to our doom-scrolling ways by bedtime, which is why I so need to hear today's gospel as someone who's still learning to live by faith, not fear. Now, not all fear is bad. Chaniqua Walker Barnes is a womanist public theologian and a clinical psychologist who just published an essay called "The Fear God Gives Us." And she distinguishes between healthy and unhealthy fear. Unhealthy fear is the fear that is afraid of itself. Fear that has morphed into anxiety, she says, that will refuse even to adapt to clear and present danger and will belittle and attack those who do. Think simply of the irrational and defiant resistance to wearing face masks that we see even here in San Francisco. She contrasts this with healthy fear, which is, she says, a function of the God-given limbic system of the brain, capable of 1,500 different biochemical responses to threat, from dilating the pupils to decreasing a sense of pain, even producing more blood-clotting platelets in case of injury. In other words, fear triggers the limbic system. It makes you faster, stronger, more focused. What may have evolved to save us from saber-toothed tigers now kicks in when we face stressors like saber-toothed economic instability or lack of medical coverage, saber-toothed racism, raging wildfires, or a once-in-a-century health crisis storm whose waves are battering the entire world. It is reasonable to be afraid in this world. We just marked the 75th anniversary of the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki this week. The same week, former Secretary of Defense William Perry, writing in a new book, says, "We stand today in greater danger of nuclear catastrophe than we ever faced during the Cold War." Fear is not just reasonable. If I weren't afraid of what's happening in the world right now, honestly, I'd look into getting a CAT scan. So, what are FDR and Jesus going on about when it comes to fear? What is bad fear? The disciples in our gospel reading today are terrified of a storm. Incidentally, their second traumatic boating incident. The first recorded in Matthew 8. There's a storm. Jesus is with them, but he's asleep. Their fear isn't just for the storm. The fear is that he doesn't care that they're going to perish. This time, he sends them away while he deals with the crowds of thousands that he's just fed, and they find themselves adrift in a storm. He put them there, and he is nowhere to be found. They are abandoned, and they're afraid. Then he comes to them across the water and says, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. Take courage, because it is I. It is I." That is a little Greek phrase, ego eimi. Those happen to be the words that are used, the Greek words used to translate the divine name in Hebrew revealed to Moses. I am. Take heart. I am. There is a resonance there that identifies Jesus as the Son of God, the one performing and revealing the will of God. And then he calms the storm. We get this same story in the synoptic gospels, that is, Mark and Luke, but only here do we get this detail about Peter's walk. The late Swiss theologian Ulrich Luz says that Peter is the archetypal disciple. Here, as in other places, he is us. His stumbles are a picture of all of our stumbles. The first, to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, he gets the message so wrong that he's rebuked with a "Get thee behind me, Satan," which is never good. Called to watch and pray with Jesus at his darkest hour, he falls asleep, bragging that he will never deny Jesus. He hits a triple denial before the cock crows. And here, he steps out in faith, but he gets spooked by the wind and sinks until Jesus takes him by the hand. Notice Jesus' question to Peter. Jesus, like a good spiritual director or therapist, just when you want them to just explain something, they ask you a question. It's so exasperating. But he asked him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" He uses a word here for doubt. It can also be translated as hesitate. It's the kind of personal confusion that prevents action or commitment. Let's say a funk. This is bad fear, incapacitating fear under which he sinks, under which we sink, because we don't believe God is present and able to save. It is a holy moment, not only for Peter, but for all of them. When Jesus calmed the storm in the first story, they ask, "Who is this?" This time, they confess, "Truly, you are the Son of God." I think Matthew is asking us this question as well, this question that Jesus gives to Peter. Are you flooded by fear? And is it causing you to doubt God's love? Is it causing you to hesitate to love? Are you cultivating a mindset? Do you find yourself cultivating a mindset of scarcity and anxiety, or rather of abundance and trust? Do you see how Jesus dispels the illusion of abandonment that feeds their neurosis? He moves towards Peter, towards us, with God's gracious and loving presence. He invites them into a spirituality that learns to move through fear into the security of God's loving, mothering arms. That's the hard-learned wisdom, I think, that enabled Joseph to persevere through enslavement, exile, resisting cynicism and bitterness, forgiving his brothers, and actually seeing God's purposes for justice at work. It's the faith that enabled Paul to see past imprisonment, death threats, and utter rejection of his message, to believe still that God's faithfulness was good news for all people. And it's what gives me courage. Grace Cathedral has been the sponsor for my ordination, for which I am incredibly grateful. I've entered the transitional diaconate in a season when churches can't even gather physically, in a time where there were already deep and troubling questions about the future of the church, about the future of Christianity in North America. I certainly don't have many answers or any good ones. But thanks to this gospel, I do think I see the way forward from little faith, doubt, and fear. It is to fix our eyes on the one who is ever present, who is ever moving toward us, saying, "Courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." Amen.